So welcome to CITERS 2017. So as you learn from a program, we will have a formal welcoming and opening in the afternoon session, as you know that. But of course, please accept my warm welcome to the CITERS. So I'm the director of CITE, Alan Yun. So then, welcome. So now, I'm very glad to have the opportunity to be the chairman of this session to introduce the first keynote speaker, my dear colleague, Professor David Carless. So he's Associate Dean Learning and Teaching, Professor of Division of English Language Education, Faculty of Education, HKU. Now, we play tennis together. He plays tennis very well. Apart playing tennis, of course, he's a very active researcher in educational research, in particular about assessment. His research interests including learning-oriented assessment in higher education, sustainable feedback, dialogic use of exemplars. He publishes widely in these areas, including a number of books, book chapters, and journal articles. His topic for today's presentation is scaling up assessment for learning. Now, without further ado, I'm not going to play tennis now, but let's invite Professor Carless to present his keynote address.
Thank you very much, Alan. I wonder how many presentations you've attended and how many have had a really significant impact on your practice or your learning. And I'm going to start with a little story from about 17 or 18 years ago. It was around the turn of the millennium. I was an early career teacher and researcher in the Education University of Hong Kong. And I had to teach the courses on assessment. The reason I had to teach the courses on assessment was because the other colleagues did not like assessment. They thought it was boring, it was difficult, you had all those kind of validity. It sounded a very painful topic to them. So I didn't at that time have great enthusiasm for assessment, but I was a young colleague. When you're a young colleague, you tend to get assigned a teaching role, and my teaching role was assessment. And then I went to this talk, and the speaker was Mary James from Cambridge University, and she talked about some new research evidence done by the Assessment Reform Group in the UK, particularly led by Paul Black and Dylan William from King's College London at the time. And it was a very persuasive talk, and she presented a lot of evidence from the Assessment Reform Group that showed the potential of formative assessment for learning, to lead to significant learning gains. And they compiled a 65-page literature review that was published in a journal, one of the longest journal articles in education ever written, and she shared some of the strategies. Now, the reason I went to the talk is because I was going to have to teach the topic, and it kind of reinvigorated me for assessment for learning, for assessment, and it gave me a number of strategies that I could use in my teaching. And then in my research, and I've done work on assessment for learning in relation to schools and also in relation to higher education, and I'm going to share some of it today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce assessment for learning and its strategies first. I'm also going to use the concept of scaling up, the idea that we can spread ideas further and deeper. And I will use the idea of MOOCs to apply some of the ideas on assessment for learning. One of my main areas of research interest is feedback, so I will talk a little bit about feedback and peer feedback and how we can use technology to facilitate feedback processes. And then finally, I will share some thoughts about leadership, some of the things that are happening in this university, and also communities of practice. One of the headings for our conference is empowering communities and about innovation, and I will also address these issues. I'm going to draw on this book that came out 3 or 4 months ago in January, and it's called Scaling Up Assessment for Learning in Higher Education, so that's where I've kind of borrowed the title of the talk. This book was a compilation that emanated from a conference held here in May 2015. We had more than 300 delegates from 27 different countries, and this was kind of one of the outputs of the work. And I'm going to draw on 2 chapters from the book. I'm going to draw on my opening chapter, which was kind of trying to frame the book, and it was called Scaling Up Assessment for Learning, Progress and Prospects. So I looked at the progress to date in assessment for learning in higher education, and then I referred to the future prospects. I'm also going to draw on a chapter, it's actually the final chapter of the book, that looked at the role of technology, because this chapter seems to fit very much with the aims of this conference. And this chapter was written by Philip Dawson and Michael Henderson. Philip Dawson from Deakin University, Michael Henderson from Monash University in Melbourne. They always tell you to define your terms, don't they? If you're doing a master's thesis or a doctoral thesis, define your terms somewhere near the outset of your piece. So this is the definition that is quite a classic definition of assessment for learning. Student learning is the top priority in assessment for learning. Now that might seem obvious. Shouldn't student learning always be our top priority? However, when you think of assessment, all of us normally think of assessment in terms of grading, in terms of judgment. So for most people, I think the first priority in assessment could be giving a fair grade, or if you're a student, your first priority is probably to pass. So there are complexities in assessment. There are synergies, potentially, between formative and summative assessment, but there are also barriers and challenges. I'm not going to go into those in detail today, but I have written about them in some of my work. So that's assessment for learning, and we also often use the term formative assessment, that is roughly synonymous. And in my work in assessment in higher education, I often use the term learning-oriented assessment to try to bridge good formative assessment and good summative assessment. So what are the main assessment for learning strategies? In my opening chapter to the Scaling Up book, I summarized the 4 key assessment for learning or learning-oriented assessment strategies as follows. Firstly, the assessment task design. So the assessments that you are setting for your students, or if you're a student yourself, the assessments that you are doing. So some of the principles of good assessment design would be that they drive higher order learning outcomes. We don't want just memorization and regurgitation. We want synthesis, we want analysis. We also believe that assessment should often relate to real life applications of the discipline, so that there is some authenticity to assessment. So there are various features of a good assessment design. It's also important to involve the assessment, involve the students in the assessment. So we need students to be making judgments, to be carrying out peer feedback, to be self-evaluating their work. And these are key principles of assessment for learning: peer evaluation, self-evaluation. Feedback is a third critical factor in assessment for learning. I've said effective feedback processes. Feedback is a process, not a thing that is delivered to students, because feedback is in order to benefit student learning. So it can't be too student-centered. It's got to take the students from where they are now to where they want to go. And feedback needs to be designed. It's not something that just comes at the end. And then fourthly, the idea that students should be beginning to appreciate the nature of quality work. So students in higher education need to know what is a good essay, what is a good oral presentation. For professors, we need to know what is a good journal article, or in RAE terms, what is a 4-star output or a 3-star output. We need to be understanding the rules of any game in which we are involved. We need to be getting a sense of quality. I know we have 1 or 2 doctoral students in the room. So if you're a doctoral student, you need to be thinking, what does a good thesis look like? What are the sections of a thesis? What is good research? What is the benchmark standard in order to reach your goal? So appreciating quality is a very critical part of learning, both for us and for our students, and for all of us throughout the lifelong learning course. We need these kind of skills throughout our career. And I will be elaborating on these four key themes, and they will act as a kind of framing device for the talk. So the other key aspect in my title is scaling up. Now the idea of scaling up is to go further with more teachers, or more schools, or more universities, or more departments, or more subjects. Scaling up also involves depth. We don't want superficial implementation of the ideas. We want a depth of understanding. We want sustainability in innovation. I think it's very tempting in IT that we try out something new. Every year there are new ideas, new devices, new strategies. We need to try them out, but we also need sustainability so that the thing can continue over a period of time and be improved continuously. The fourth feature of scaling up is the idea of shift in ownership. So again, if I follow the IT analogy, if an individual has their own brilliant idea or brilliant use of mobile technology, how can they pass this on to other colleagues? How can they motivate other colleagues to carry them out? So these are four features that are coming from the innovation literature. So Coburn is talking about educational innovation, and I'm trying to apply them to the idea of assessment for learning in higher education. So having said I'm trying to probe scaling up of assessment for learning, well, why? What is the evidence base for scaling up assessment for learning? In my introductory remarks, I've given an initial flavour of the Black and William work. I'm sure you're also familiar with John Hattie's work on visible learning. In terms of student survey data, we're acutely aware in this university, in Australia, in New Zealand, in the UK, that students generally are not particularly satisfied with their assessment and feedback experience. So the National Student Survey in England and Wales regularly indicates that assessment and feedback are aspects of their learning experience that are the least satisfactory to students. So that's a further impetus for change. So I gave a flavour in my opening remarks about this work by Black and William. Here I've got a little bit of additional substance. So they reviewed around 300 articles in their massive literature review, and they found very powerful evidence of the impact of formative assessment or assessment for learning on learner achievement. The message was, if you carry out formative assessment for learning well in your classroom, your students are going to improve, and the students are going to improve significantly. Effect sizes of around 0.4 to 0.7, which are fairly good. But, and there's always a but, it's not easy to do. The implementation is generally weak. There are a lot of quite complex ideas to get your head around, and as I hinted earlier, you've got this tricky relationship with grading, summative assessment, exams, etc. So trying to do formative assessment, perhaps particularly in Hong Kong, is something of a challenge, and it needs teacher development, teacher skills, the development of assessment literacy. We also have Hattie's famous work. Now you can see here, we've got a fairly long list, and of course it goes down and down and down. There's about 140 in the list. Feedback, doing pretty well. Effect size 0.73, that's pretty good. But feedback is an interesting one. The evidence shows that some feedback interventions are relatively unsuccessful, some are very successful. There's a whole range of different effects. So feedback, again, is not a panacea. Just keep giving students feedback. It won't necessarily work. There's a lot of complexity there. Any other things that seem to relate to assessment for learning? Metacognitive strategies. I was talking about the peer evaluation and self-evaluations. We got them here. Self-report grades, right at the top. He doesn't have actually very many studies on self-report grades, so I think that's a slight artifact of the methodology. Formative evaluation, he's meaning here feedback from the teachers to the students. But my claim would be that we have 1, 2, maybe reciprocal thinking 3, 4, quite a lot of relationship there with assessment for learning in the strategies that Hattie has proven are very powerful for student learning. And those are just sort of the top 20 of a much longer list. Okay, so I've tried to share what assessment for learning is, what are the key strategies, what scaling up might involve, and how we might be scaling it up, and the rationale for that. Now I'm going to look at probably the most ambitious attempt to scale up education is the MOOC, the Massive Open Online Course. The MOOC, as you know, is open to everybody, so it is potentially a massive scaling up operation. But of course you also know there are problems and challenges, and I will try and illustrate some of the assessment for learning ideas that may or not be in MOOCs. So if we think of the assessment design in a MOOC, Dawson and Henderson in their chapter in my book, they talk about the alignment. And I think some of you know that the concept of alignment was invented in this very building by John Biggs many years ago. The alignment of goals, activities, and low-stakes assessment. Traditionally in a MOOC you have quite a lot of low-stakes assessment quizzes, automated answers. You're not getting a lot of human feedback, but you're getting some feedback on whether your chosen answers are correct. But in that kind of scenario, is there a lot of higher order thinking going on? Is there a lot of complex learning in doing the quizzes and getting the answers? Possibly not. One of the other major features of MOOCs is peer assessment. That because of the need for scaling, it's impossible for one professor who may be heading this MOOC to analyze thousands and thousands of assignments. So peer assessment is a major feature. And they need the rubric, so the rubric probably needs to be more detailed because you're catering for a large number of markers from different backgrounds and different capacities. So I'm sure you're thinking, well, how reliable are these participants in the MOOC in doing their peer review and the peer assessment? The evidence is they're not very reliable, but they're not very unreliable, moderate reliability. And Tim Hugh, our conference chair, has done a very interesting article which looked at some evidence from popular MOOCs. MOOCs that had lots of people involved and seemed to be appreciated and highly rated by the participants. And one of the features of popular MOOCs was that by using multiple peer assessment, then they reduce the potential variance in marks. So if you only are peer reviewed by one person, then the reliability is risky. But if you have 4 or 5, there's more potential for the average to reduce any variance. And I suppose all the time I'm wondering about the implications for the MOOC experience and our normal daily conventional teaching and learning processes. Now this is a very important finding from the regular educational research literature, that actually students gain more from composing peer feedback than receiving it. And I think this isn't that obvious. Some of us might think that the aim of peer feedback is for you to get some comments from a partner, from another participant. And that is useful. But you know what it's like? Sometimes your partner just says, there was a typo on page 6, but otherwise it was pretty good, and they don't necessarily fully engage in the process. One important message is we need to train students much more effectively in doing peer feedback. We can't really just say go into a group and give comments to your classmate. They need to have training and modelling, and the teacher needs to guide them and scaffold them. The teacher also needs to give feedback to the students on their peer feedback. So when you're giving feedback to your peer, you need somebody to say, well, that kind of comment is a useful one, that kind of comment is not so accurate. That kind of comment could be elaborated. You should be commenting on the higher order elements, not just the grammar and the spelling, the easy things to spot. Okay? Now, the visual there, you've got a sort of brain, and I'm trying to illustrate some cognitive thinking going on. So the main reasons why composing peer feedback is more of a learning experience than receiving is that in order to compose peer feedback, in order to do it well, in order to do it seriously, you have to involve in some quite deep cognitive thinking. You have to analyze. You have to analyze the text you're commenting on. You have to identify the strengths and weaknesses. Even more challenging, you've then got to elaborate how the person can tackle the weaknesses. Now, I hope you'll agree with me, those are quite deep cognitive processes of analysis, diagnosis, problem solution. So peer feedback, when done well, and I should say it's often not done very well, but when it's done well, it involves quite a deep learning process. So imagine these students on the MOOC, they're analysing 4 or 5 of their classmates' work. If they do this well, this could be a very deep learning experience for them. And in Tim Hughes' work, he's given some evidence that shows that actually the students found the peer review process of the MOOC one of the most interesting, inspiring and useful experience. And I think that has implications for our own classrooms. Train the students in peer feedback, communicate to them why they should do it, let them practice, give them feedback, and they need to do it multiple times across the curriculum. As I said in relation to Hattie's work, metacognitive strategies are a key aspect of formative assessment, assessment for learning, and there's this interrelationship between peer evaluation and self-evaluation. Self-evaluation, of course, a very critical element of human learning. The best students are the ones who can self-evaluate well. I even suggest the best scholars are the ones who can self-evaluate well. Self-evaluation is an absolute key to lifelong learning. And if you haven't read the work of David Bowd, I particularly recommend his work. He's compiled in some of his recent work some very persuasive evidence of the relationship between self-evaluative capacities and high achievement. Excellent students are invariably good at self-evaluation. They're often a bit critical, and being critical is good. The weakest students usually overestimate their capacities, and that's one of the reasons they get poor marks. They think their work is good, they think they've done a decent job, they submit it, they then get a low grade, and they're surprised. So if we're able to develop the self-evaluative capacities of our students, we'll be setting the scene for improvement. And in this article by Tim Hume, in one of the MOOCs he was analysing, the students did 5 peer reviews first before doing the evaluation, the self-evaluation. Can you see how powerful that is? That having done the peer review first, you're developing a sense of quality. You're developing a sense of how your work positions in relation to other members of the cohort. So that's actually a facilitating factor for doing self-evaluation. Do the peer review first, then you've got a benchmark for comparison. Okay, I'm going to now come on to feedback processes using technology, which, as you may remember, was the third strand in assessment for learning. So I've covered assessment design relatively briefly. I've talked about students practicing judgments. Now I'm moving on to the third strand of feedback. Okay, it's quite a trend in the literature in the last 8 or 10 years, or particularly in the last 3 to 5 years, in the UK and in Australia, the idea of audio and video feedback. So instead of writing comments or sending them by email or annotating the script, instead of doing that, teachers are increasingly giving feedback via audio or video, and it can be sent fairly simply through the learning management system or via MP3, etc. Okay? Now, some of the advantages of this kind of audio and video feedback are the kind of personalization. You can say, hello Tony, hello John, how are you today? Thank you for your assignment, this is what my commentary is. The students feel that there is a more personal touch. From the teacher perspective, more nuance, more ability to hedge and to use sort of careful language. So a bit of potential in audio and video feedback. Is it a monologue or is it a dialogue? It seems like a dialogue because you're talking to the person, but actually in reality it's only a monologue. And to me that's one of the major limitations. My perspective on feedback is it needs to have more of an interactive, dialogic nature. That's why I'm very enthusiastic about peer feedback, because the peers are having a dialogue. Teacher to student is very difficult to scale up. We haven't got the time, we haven't got the resources to have individual conversations in much depth. But peer-to-peer feedback can be scaled up. The other element is time saving or time addition. And in the literature, there is a kind of mixed view on this issue. Some people claim that once you've done it, once or twice, you can handle the technology very quickly, and you can speak much quicker than you can write. So there is a theory that actually using audio feedback or video feedback at scale is time saving. Other people find the opposite, and clearly you have to do it in one take. You can't keep doing it over and over again. But an interesting area, I think not yet caught on in Hong Kong, but we're talking of innovation in this conference, so maybe audio and video feedback is one for the future. When I was preparing this talk earlier this week, I did what I guess you often do. I went to Google Scholar, I entered video feedback, and what came up was the literature that I was already familiar with. And then, as you probably do, I played around with the dates a little bit. So I tried since 2016. And I made a little interesting discovery that I will share with you on the next slide. I rather like this idea. Peer-to-peer video feedback. So instead of the teacher doing the audio or video feedback, it was peers. As I've already indicated, I'm enthusiastic about peer-to-peer feedback in general in the classroom. But here we have another additional possibility, peer-to-peer video feedback, and it was facilitated by Facebook. We all know Facebook is attractive to the learners. This study was done in Taiwan. It was actually in a regular classroom. But it made me think, why don't they do this in MOOCs? Peer-to-peer video feedback. If one of the features of the MOOC is peer assessment and peer feedback, why not compose a short 3 or 4 minute segment? Perhaps I should have said that the audio video feedback is usually approximately 3 minutes long, 2 to 3 minutes to summarize some main points. So an interesting study there, peer-to-peer video feedback in a university in Taiwan. And you can see the happy student there. She seems to be enjoying it. We had a very good professor here 2 weeks ago, Abelardo Pardo from University of Sydney, and he's also doing very interesting work on feedback with learning analytics, and you've got his website there, and some further potential there, I think, in the use of learning analytics to develop personalized feedback, but at scale through the use of technology. And Abelardo is teaching a very large class. He has like 200, 250 students, but he does have a number of advantages. He's a computer software designer by profession, and he works in the Faculty of Engineering. Fantastic guy, and if you're interested, the website is there. By the way, the slides are posted on SlideShare, so if you enter my name in SlideShare or SlideShare and my name, you will get them. Basically, the ideas I've been sharing around peer feedback, around dialogue, are part of what I call sustainable feedback. So unsustainable feedback is when it's always the teacher having to say to the student, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. Sustainable feedback is encouraging the students to do peer feedback. It's teaching them how to do peer feedback. It's training them. It's also encouraging them to do self-evaluation. It's trying to support the notion of lifelong learners, and that students need to be generating and using feedback as part of their own self-monitoring and metacognitive strategies. I now go on to the fourth strand of assessment for learning, the idea of developing student appreciation of quality. And remember, I've claimed that this is one of the hallmarks of being a good lifelong learner, and it applies to all of us in this room, whether we are students, teachers, or both, or professors, that we need to understand what is quality in the things we need to do. So we need to know what's quality teaching, what's quality research, what's quality for your study, etc. Now, in the final chapter to my edited book, Dawson and Henderson claim, and I have some sympathy with them, that MOOCs are not particularly effective at developing this aspect. And the challenges are obvious in terms of the massiveness of the enterprise. So I think that's fair comment. However, in light of the analysis I've done of Tim Hughes' work and the peer review, I would claim that the peer review followed by self-evaluation strategy was supporting the students in that particular MOOC to develop an understanding of quality. But remember, Tim Hughes' article that I've cited was about popular and effective MOOCs, not about MOOCs in general. In my view, one of the most persuasive and powerful ways of developing an understanding of quality is through exemplars. By an exemplar, I simply mean a sample of the target performance. So if you're a doctoral student, your sample might be the doctoral thesis. If you're trying to do a research method chapter for your work, then it will be a sample of research methodology. If you're trying to write a journal article for a high impact journal, your sample is going to be the previous published work. If you're writing a poem, you probably want to look at some other poems of different genres. Okay? I think this is how we learn. I think we learn through trying to understand the different genres, and we try to understand what is good performance in these genres, and then we try to make an attempt, and then we self-evaluate. We may have a peer who can give us some comment on our draft poem, method chapter, thesis, etc. But we're using exemplars to try to get a sense of quality, and we're comparing and contrasting our work with the exemplars. So the exemplar is your target, your work is here, and you're trying to bridge the gap between the two through analysis and through dialogue. And Kennedy Chan, our colleague from Science Education, and myself, we recently published an article which is called Managing Dialogic Use of Exemplars. So our main claim is the exemplar should not be seen as a model, should not be seen as something that's copied, but as something that is an illustration of different dimensions of quality. And it's only through discussion and dialogue that we can bring out the features of the target performance. Now, in relation to the MOOC, this dialogue presumably is going to be very difficult to achieve. Although that peer-to-peer video that I mentioned might be a facilitating factor. So to sum up in terms of appreciating quality, students need to be facilitated either in class or through technological means to be having a discussion and a debate about what quality is. And I think this is a similar argument for schooling. Whatever you're trying to teach your students in your school, they need to understand what are the success criteria, what are they expected to achieve, and what good performance in that domain looks like. Okay, so I've said a little bit about each of the 4 key strategies of assessment for learning, and I've tried to relate them to the bigger picture of scaling up and in relation to MOOCs and in relation to technology. In the last 5 minutes or so, I will just sum up some of the wider messages. Again, going back to the Dawson and Henderson chapter, I think this is an important message for this conference and for innovation in IT, that if we just add on a bit of technology to our existing design, it's going to be very difficult. So we need to look at design in a more holistic and complex way. If I give a concrete example of that in relation to audio and video feedback. So if you just teach your class in the normal way, and then at the end of the class you give them some video feedback, I have a feeling it's going to be relatively unsuccessful. It needs a more fundamental design of what is the role of the video feedback in your design. I think I need a little drink of water, if you'll excuse me. I've used the word invest there. I don't know if some of you are very rich people who indulge in investing in the Hang Seng Index, but investment needs money and resources. And here we go. We're very fortunate. Our Vice President for Teaching and Learning, Ian Holliday, has invested a certain amount of resources in terms of the development not only of MOOCs but of technology and technology-enhanced learning, and he's also offering kind of rewards and incentives. We all need some kind of reward and incentive to move forward. And one of the resources is the Technology Enriched Learning Initiative, and Ian Holliday, our Vice President, has appointed Ricky Kwok to be the Associate Vice President. Ricky is in the Faculty of Engineering, and if you can see the picture reasonably well, you can see him there doing some mobile learning. But he's in front of a wall. I was a bit worried there might be a firing squad about to assassinate him, but he seems to have survived. So the Technology Enriched Learning Initiative has strands such as e-learning, MOOCs, etc. What about rewards? Around 2 years ago, the university launched a new Teaching Innovation Award. So this is an award that encourages teachers to innovate, and particularly to use e-learning and IT as part of their innovative teaching practices. We also have an even newer award that was only launched last month, which is a Teaching Feedback Award, and this is our first student-led award. So the students make the nominations, the students explain the rationale for their nominations. So this is trying to bring in the idea of students as partners into our award system, and I think it's the right way to go. And I have a feeling that if you're able to do peer-to-peer video feedback effectively, you're probably going to win this award. Very finally, the idea of communities of practice, and again I'm drawing on a chapter from our edited collection by Di Hounsel and Tracy Zoe. The idea that we need to surface practices. There could be good practices out there, but we don't know necessarily some of the good things that are going on. So it's why we have a conference like this, to give people an opportunity to surface and share their practices. We sometimes abbreviate communities of practice to COPs, and I think you know there are good COPs and bad COPs. And here you have a good COP. Actually, you can't see him probably well. Maybe the lighting isn't so good. But anyway, he's a kind COP. So what would a good community of practice, a good COP, involve? Well, it would involve dialogue. It would involve communication. It might involve shared goals. I think it would involve some sharing of community and some accountability. In the community, you need to be working together with common goals. And I think the common goals in my work are to try to scale up assessment for learning so that we have spread, we have depth, we have sustainability, and we have shifts in ownership. Finally, if there's anything I've been saying today that is of interest to you, this is probably my signature piece of work, Excellence in University Assessment, that came out in 2015. This is the story of 5 teachers who were recognized for teaching excellence. And they were in 5 different disciplines: architecture, business, geology, history, and law. And I followed their classes in a kind of ethnographically oriented way, and I wrote up their assessment for learning practices in this book. So you've got a long list of references here. And that's it. Thank you very much. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think that before the coffee break, then we still have a couple of 10 minutes for discussion. Any question, comment?
Testing.
Good morning. Thank you for your sharing about the importance of assessments. I totally agree with you that it helps learning. But unfortunately, especially in Hong Kong students, they think assessment is a kind of competitive tool. It may be influenced by the parents and also by the teachers. One question is how we can change their mind, the paradigm shift, so that they think assessment as a kind of learning rather than as a kind of competitive tool. And secondly, what you have mentioned about this kind of peer-to-peer assessment, could it apply to younger learning, such as elementary students? Could it be workable? I have two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. The first question I struggled with earlier in my career for at least 20 years. I've been in Hong Kong for 30 years now, and I started in the secondary school system. And I can remember when I was a secondary school teacher in Hong Kong, I'd been in the school a few weeks, and then the panel chair said to me, next week the students will do a quiz. Now in England, a quiz is something fun, it's something with rewards, it's a kind of game and you enjoy it. I thought, oh, a quiz, that sounds fun. But a few weeks later I realised a quiz is a test, but it's a slightly lower stakes. Then you have a test, then you have an exam. So you have 3 summative events, quiz, test and exam, and as you've correctly pointed out, not a lot of learning going on, it's very grade focused. I have tried to do research on this area. For 5 years I went into the schools and I tried to promote assessment for learning ideas with some but perhaps limited success. The one technique that resonated with the teachers was how to analyze a test in order to identify student weaknesses and areas for improvement, and then to do some follow-up after the test that could help to minimize some of those challenges that were illustrated. And the title of one of my earlier books was From Testing to Productive Student Learning, and it was analysing this tension that you've correctly illustrated between testing and student learning. One of the reasons I stopped doing this research and did my research entirely in higher education is for the reasons you're hinting at, that actually it was very, very difficult. Culture is not something that you or I can change. Culture is ingrained, and I'm rather fearful that our prospects for developing a more formative orientation in the schools, sorry to be a little bit depressing, but I'm not very optimistic. However, peer feedback, I think, can be done at any age and at any level. And certainly my children, when they've been in school, and I'm sure your children, it's the same, they have done group projects, they've been involved in peer collaboration. It often ends in argument, sometimes even ends in tears, but I think that they are able, if trained and supported, to give some peer feedback. But of course it will not be as sophisticated, it will be a different kind of peer feedback. But I think students are able to do that at all ages. But in general, I don't think we're very good at teaching them to do that. I think in general, teachers, we're quite good at standing up the front and giving a lecture or input, but we're not so good at the process-oriented things. I don't think many of us are that good at managing group work or setting very good group tasks. How to do these kind of process-oriented things, training the students to do the peer feedback, coaching them, mentoring them. I think in general, teachers in university and in schools, we're not generally that good at doing that. We're better at the sort of teacher-fronted kind of things. But thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any other? Yes?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Carless. I think I really enjoyed your sharing. Can I just ask, because you have been teaching and at all levels in secondary and university. Back to assessment for learning. Did you find that there is a marked difference from 20, 30 years ago to now? I mean, now we're more sophisticated learners, especially at university. And in fact, there was a comment that at top universities, you don't need to teach the student because they all learn by themselves, you know. And from my experience in accrediting university for my professional work, sometimes that's quite true because the top university do have top students, so they are able to achieve a lot on their own. So from your experience in terms of assessment for learning, do you see a marked difference in the ages and whether technology, because today is about innovation in and applying technology, would that make a change for the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know the answer. It's difficult sometimes over the course of a 20 or 30 year period to really evaluate these kind of developments. So I think I'm not sure. I think we are making progress in understanding and developing assessment for learning. I think we are developing insights into feedback. I think there are elements of technology that we're using more effectively. I think we've all agreed that it's the pedagogy, not the technology, that should go first. So it shouldn't be the technology driving innovation, but it should be the pedagogical issue that you're trying to address. I think we're making progress, but I think in education, as in life, progress is incremental and it's sometimes iterative. So it's sometimes one step forward, two steps back, and then one step forward again. I don't think it's a linear kind of progress, but yeah, I think I'm cautiously optimistic that we're sort of progressing in various of those domains that I've mentioned.
Can I have a follow-on? You know, because the AIs, I mean, recently we have AlphaGo defeating a human. And therefore there was quite a lot of discussion online about education and what universities should be teaching for the future. And I think today's conference is so relevant because going forward, whether we like it or not, technology is going to be there as an aid or it could be a threat. You know, so we have the discussion on assessment for learning, but in terms of the relevancy in the future, the type of skills that students need to learn in order to be able to be successful, what would you advocate? Thank you.
I think some of the skills that I've highlighted are absolutely critical for lifelong learning, and they always will be. That idea of developing understanding of quality. You know, in the online world, there is so much information there, you need to be able to judge it. You need to be able to evaluate all that massive information that's coming. So I think the skills of evaluative judgment are absolutely critical for lifelong learning in an online digital world.
Okay, thank you. Now, any other question? Yep.
Thank you, Professor Carless. I have a very simple question, actually. So in Hong Kong, we have EMI school and Chinese medium school. So do you think that it's better to use the L1 language to do peer assessment or use the L2 in the EMI school? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I think you should do it in the language that will most fulfill the goals that you're aiming for. So if you want the person to practice language, then do it in the language that will facilitate the practice of language. But I guess you're trying to hone their evaluative judgment skills. So it would make more sense, in my opinion, for them to do the activity in the language that would help them give insightful peer feedback and have a good conversation. And that would generally be the mother tongue.
Okay, now that will be the last question before our coffee break. Who would like to take the last one?
Come on, Tim, you've been sitting there. You're an expert on MOOCs. Illuminate us with your wisdom. No, he says no. He'll kill me later instead. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, thank you, Professor. A lot of the topics that you touched on have been things that I've been thinking about as well. One thing when you talked about the MOOCs, and especially feedback, a lot of MOOCs now, they use peer feedback to actually give grades or to assess the students. And one thing I found as a student in a MOOC is that sometimes people don't have they're not as conscientious as everyone else. So one thing I've been thinking about is this thing called the prisoner's dilemma, which is people working in their perceived self-interest as opposed to actually collaborating. So what would you suggest for teachers dealing with students thinking or facing those kind of dilemmas? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question, and again, I don't know the answer. But I think you will probably imagine from the perspective I've been taking that I see the peer feedback as potentially most beneficial to the individual, to the composer. So I suggest to you that maybe on your MOOC, instead of worrying about whether the other guys did a good job or were fair, that you actually spend more time analysing their work and activate those cognitive strategies I was working on. And I think the more work you put into analysing their work, I think the more learning you will derive. And my argument is we should be focused more on the learning rather than the fairness of the grading. But that's my own personal perspective, and I agree that other people will take a different perspective, and maybe Harvey Goldstein this afternoon will take a different kind of perspective. But for me, student learning is the top priority, and I think you could actually probably learn a lot through doing a very in-depth analysis of the other people's work, and then going back to your work and analysing again what you think you did well in relation to their performance, what you think you could do better, and sort of using this as a springboard for onward going forward. And I mean, this is what we do in academic life. We're subject to peer review continuously. We're sending out work to journals. We're sending out work for evaluation. And of course, some of the colleagues will say, the peer review was not fair. The evaluator didn't understand. Why did they only give me a 2-star when it should have been a 3-star, etc., etc. But to me, that's a little bit of a red herring. I think we should be thinking, well, what are the messages we can draw where we can move our work forward and get even better as a lifelong learner? But I understand your dilemma. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Carless. Could you join me to thank Professor Carless